Hey guys, John from JBR here and welcome to this week's Rotary tech video. Today I'm going to do something a little bit different to what I usually do. I'm going to be pulling apart what's in this box, which is an FD RX7 crate motor straight from Mazda in Japan. These engines, they're not available in Australia. You've got to buy them out of either Japan or USA or New Zealand. Not really sure what the idea with that is, but Mazda Australia don't bring them in. Used to be about $8.5 grand landed here, but since the scamdemic and the COVID tax, the price has gone up to about 11 G's. So it's probably cheaper to buy the engine in parts now as opposed to buying one complete. I have had mixed success with them. Some I pulled apart and they've been brand new. Others I've pulled apart. I even had one that picked up all of the bearings in the motor and all the bearings needed to be replaced, which was on a brand spanking motor. So with this engine, I'll get it apart. I'll show you the process of how to strip the engine down, the tools that you're going to need, and then once that's done, I'll go through and measure everything, show you what needs checking, and we'll see how good of a job Mazda's done, and we'll go from there. First step, we got to get this engine out of the cardboard box and onto the engine stand. To do that, I'm going to use this new crane that I've got mounted up above my head here. Last weekend, I had to lift a 20B engine from the ground up onto the engine stand, and I just about blew a puffer valve. So Baz came up with the ingenious idea of putting a crane up in the roof to lift the engines on and off the stand with. So I'm going to give that a go now, get it out of the box, and that's our first step. Get it onto the crane. You just hook the chain up. The motors come with the lifting lugs already on them, which makes life a little bit easier. All you got to do is hook your own chain up, and then we can connect that up to the crane and lift it straight out. It. A thing of beauty. The tools you're going to need to strip an engine down, basically everything here on the bench is all you need. We've got a 10mm, 12mm and a 14mm spanner, 10, 12, 17 and 19mm socket, 6-inch extension, screwdriver for getting the sump off. We're going to need a hammer, the dowel puller, a big breaker bar, the leg spreader. I'll show you what that's used for as we go. And I use a 1/2-inch drive rattle gun and a 3/4-inch drive rattle gun. They're not essential, but they just make the job a little bit quicker. The only specialty tool that you're really going to need that you won't already have in your toolbox is a 55mm socket for getting the nut off the flywheel, but otherwise everything's pretty simple and straightforward, and a dowel puller, but otherwise that's got you covered, and that should get the entire motor apart. First thing I like to do once I've got the engine up on the hoist and before I put it on this stand, I'll crack the sump plug open to so the oil starts draining out. They are supposed to ship with no oil in them, but all of them end up coming here and they're half full of oil. So you don't make a mess on the floor. I'll always drain the oil out now and let it sit for a little while I'm prepping it up to put it on the stand. To do that, 19mm socket or breaker bar. And as you can see, an engine that's not supposed to have any oil in it has got plenty of oil in it. So I'll let that run for a few minutes. Don't drink that, dog. It won't do you much good. While that's draining, I'll prep the other side of the engine so it goes onto the engine stand. I'll go ahead, rip all the tape off, the ports, and all the other stuff that this is blocking off. To get the engine on the stand, you're going to need to use one of these Rotary engine adapters, and they bolt up to the front plate. Just like this. It's got one bolt goes in the top and then a nut down on the bottom. You don't need to go and tighten that up too tight because it's not going to bounce off. Just finger tight's good enough. Then before we put it back onto the stand, or onto the stand for the first time I should say, we'll put the sump plug back in so we're not spilling too much oil, and move that. Then now it's on the stand, the fun begins. We can start stripping it down. I always start with getting the front pulley off and the flywheel off. You don't need any special tools to lock the flywheel. The chain we use to pull the engine out of the crate, we can just bolt that on to the flywheel and onto the rear plate, and that can be used to lock the motor over or used as a flywheel stopper. All you need to do is go through one of the bolt holes for the pressure plate like that with a pressure plate bolt. And that'll lock the engine spinning that way. I always use my rattle gun for this. You're going to need a 3/4 drive one. The 1/2 inch drive one doesn't have enough grunt to do it. Take the nut off, but I'll always just put it back on a few threads. I'll show you why in a second. Before we do finish the flywheel end, we need to start on the other end and get the front pulley off. So we'll just spin that round and lock it up in the other direction. And on the front, if we have a look in here, it's got 4 10mm bolts that need to come off first, that a lot of people miss. So I've got this little device in here that locks the front nut in place so it can't spin. I've never in my life had one come loose before, and Mazda Loctite these, and they are also super duper tight. And for the front pulley bolt, because they're Loctited in, they're always a real bastard to get out on these FD engines. So I use the big girl again. This time with a 19mm. And that's that done. and we pull the thermo pellet and the spring out. I don't ever use those on any of my engines, so that can go in the pile. Front pulley off. Now we go back to the back of the motor. We'll take the chain off and get that out of the way so we can now take the flywheel off. So all the flywheel was there for in that last instances so we can lock the front nut up. So once this is done, again, you don't need any special tools. There's a bit of a knack for getting these off. And if you lock that down in the rear of the engine like that, between the rear plate and the flywheel, and you give it a hit with a hammer like that, you usually don't have to put too much weight on it, and all you need to do is vibrate it off the taper and it will slide straight off. Now the reason I put this nut back on, it's pretty standard. If you hit that flywheel, it can fall all the way off and land on your foot. So if you put the nut back on, that stops it from going any further. It won't fall off, hit you on the toe. There we have it, flywheel's off. Once the flywheel on the front pulley is off, before I flip the engine up to do the sump, I'll always turn the engine up first, because in most cases, not only are they full of oil, but they're also got a bit of water in them as well. So despite the fact that we drained all the oil out of the sump, usually when you tip them up like this, there's a whole heap more splooge will come out, and there's even more oil that will come out that was obviously up around in the timing cover area. So I'll sit the engine up like that with the tray under it for another 5 minutes and let as much of that drain out as possible so it doesn't make as much mess when I strip it down. While the last few remnants of oil and water are still draining out of the motor, I'll start on the sump. Mazda put these bolts all in here, which are for the engine mounts on the FD. When they seal the sump up, they'll put those in so the Celastic dries properly, and when you get your crate motor, you can just take those off, put the mounts on, and everything should be sealed up and the sump won't leak. So get those off first. You can do that with a 1/2 inch rattle gun. Then with those done, it's time for the sump bolts, which we'll need the 10mm socket for. So double handling, always got a tub on hand, chuck all the nuts and bolts into that as you go. And it's probably not a bad idea to keep a rag handy as well while you're doing it. While the oil's draining out of the front still and the water, I'll start taking the sump off. These are always a right bastard to get off. Mazda glues them on pretty damn tight so they don't leak. So for me it's not a big deal because I'm not going to be using this sump again, but more often than not, when you pull these off, you'll end up in the sump. Easiest way I found to do it is just get a screwdriver in along this back edge and start working your way along it a little bit. And once you get it started, this is where the leg spreader can come in handy again. You've got a big enough gap down in there, you can usually get the leg spreader down in there and break the seal. and then the sump's off. And with the sump done, I'll flip the motor back up now and we'll loosen the front cover off. I'll take the entire front cover off. And when we flip it up, again, just hold the tray under it because there's usually a heap more oil will come out just when you think you've got it all. You never do. Now with the front cover, the bolts that hold that on, you need a 12mm socket for those. And with those all out, you can just give the front cover a quick tap with a hammer. I just do it underneath here where the oil regulator is, and it'll pop straight off. The front cover off, we can then slide the distributor drive gear off. Then we get to the oil pump and the oil pump chain. A lot of guys will loosen the front nut off on the oil pump. I never ever bother doing that. I prefer to leave it all in one piece, which makes it a lot easier to assemble it later on and keeps all the parts in one place. So you've got the 4 bolts holding the oil pump on. Once you've got the key removed out of the front, which came out when we slid the front pulley out, you can just slide the front counterweight around out the way, and that gives you access to these 4 10mm headed bolts that hold the oil pump on. Then, once we've got all these 4 out, you can slide the whole oil pump, the oil pump chain and the drive gear that's on the crank. All of those will slide up together and off. Drop that back in there. And the counterweight can come off. The front thrust bearing, the spacer, you can either pull that off or leave it there, it doesn't really matter. But now with this done, we can flip her up and start on the back now. With the oil pump and the front counterweight taken off, don't take the front stationary gear out yet, leave that there. That will support the crank while we're flipping the engine up and pulling the rest of the engine apart. So get it down to this point, leave the thrust plate and stat gear in place. Then we flip it back up. And before we forget, we need to take this key out from the rear flywheel. These sometimes will come out easy. You can just grab a pair of pliers and it'll slide out, but often they will be a little bit tight. If it is a little bit tight, you can just get a screwdriver down in behind it and give it a little bit of a tap with a hammer. And lever it out like that. We'll do all of the through bolts next. They need a 17mm socket, and usually you're better off breaking all these with a breaker bar. The rattle gun doesn't break them free, I think because they've got the rubber washer underneath them. When they rattle, it actually springs backwards and forwards on the bolt and it won't loosen it. So I'll go around with a breaker bar and just crack them all. And then, once we've got them all loosened off, we can go back to the rattle gun. nice and quick and easy to line them all out. Once all through bolts are out, this is where the fun starts. We'll get the rear plate off and we'll start having a look inside this thing. You will need your hammer to give it a little bit of a massage. Because the plates and the housings are glued together with Celastic down in the bottom, it is quite normal for them to stick a little bit. So I usually just give them a little bit of a tap underneath here on that lug until you see it start to move. Then I'll shove a finger in the port, another hand over this side so it pulls off nice and square. And there we go. Now we start to get into the nitty gritty. I don't reuse any of the water seals, so once I lift the plate off, I'll pull these seals off and usually just hang them over the end of the engine stand. Now, next step is we need to get the dowels out. You will need a proper dowel puller to get these out, but they do come out nice and easy like that. Then, time for the housing to come off. Now when you pull the housing off, I always try to be really careful to do it nice and steady, because the apex seals will spring out and fly everywhere if you're not paying attention, because they still got the spring tension on them, which is up against the housing. So if you give the housing just a little bit of a wiggle and then slide it straight up, if you do it gently just like that, the apex seals will still stay in one place. And a little trick that I use is to get this outer used apex, or used water seal I should say, and wrap it around the apex seals like that, which holds everything in place. It stops them from springing all over the floor and having a yard sale. Then rotor comes off next, and again you just give it a light little bit of a wiggle as it's coming up. Try and pull it off nice and square, and if you do everything right, it'll come off just like that. Then, with the rotor off, we're almost halfway there. Pull the next lot of water seals off. And we need to get the dowels out that are in the front rotor housing so we can rotate the plate to get up over top of the crank. Then to get the plate off, it will only come off one way, and it needs to twist up and around the lobe of the crank. So to do that, you put the lobe of the crank and point it straight towards the intake side of the motor, and with the dowels out, we can now tilt the plate like so, then straighten it back up, and it will all slide straight off like that. Then crank can come out. This one here actually looks pretty good. Hasn't had a moment at the factory. Front rotor housing next. Nice and steady. Then the same process with the front rotor. Use the front outer water seal. We'll go around the apex seals again so they don't spring out. Then when we lift the rotor off, I always like to give it a slide on the plate and flip it up, and that helps prevent all of the side seals and corner seals sticking to the side plate and falling out. And then once that's done, that's your demo on how to strip the engine. I'll go ahead, I'll clean all these parts up, and I'll be back and we'll make another video on measuring all the parts. We'll check the bearings, we'll check all of the seal clearances, and see how good of a job Mazda's done, and if this engine's good enough to go back together. Thanks guys for watching. I'll see you again next week with the part 2 of this video.